Hello everyone, I'm Eileen Gallagher and I'm the Chair of Trustees at LGB Alliance. With me today is Cath Leng. Cath's a former senior journalist at the BBC who's now in a leading role in Scene in Journalism, which is an organisation that fights bias within our broadcasters and our news outlets. So Cath, you were at the BBC for a grand total of 25 years, rising to very senior positions in the BBC, including News 24 and Hard Talk. And one of your main jobs is to ensure impartiality and check facts. But you chose to leave after becoming a high-profile whistleblower. You were, in fact, sounding the alarm about the bias that you perceived that existed in the BBC reporting, particularly on LGBT stories and, in particular, the trans issue itself. So we'll start from the beginning, if we can. Can you just tell us, Cath, how you first became aware there was a problem with bias on this issue at the BBC?
It was, hi Eileen, lovely to be with you. It was way back in 2016, so 8 years ago now. So the issue with, in 2015, when the BBC first started broadcasting very, very gender affirmative material on Victoria, Derbyshire, that did pass me by. I thought it was odd. I thought there's no such thing as children who are born in the wrong body, but I thought it was just a curiosity. I didn't think anything more of it. But then when Chelsea Manning was in the news, Chelsea Manning was in the news for Bradley Manning, was in the news, he'd been jailed and he was about to be pardoned by Obama. And so we were covering this story quite a lot. And
was that the story about the theft of sensitive documents?
The WikiLeaks story, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And we were writing this story up, and he was called she everywhere, and so I just wrote it up with he. I wrote that he now identified and says he's a woman. Put his name as Chelsea because that was his name now. And I was told to write, we have to write she. And somebody came running around the newsroom telling us all to write she. I couldn't really get beyond the fact that it just wasn't true. It wasn't specifically feminist or anti-trans or anything. It was just, this simply is not true. And you're telling me to say something that isn't true. And oddly, I thought this was going to come back on me because it was my job. I was like the chief sup, and it was my job to make sure that everything we said was true. And oddly, I thought somebody is going to come. It's going to be my fault when it comes out that this person is not a woman, and I'm going to be blamed because I didn't correct everybody. Anyway, I was overruled. I mean, there were people, too many kind of editorial layers above me, who decided that we were going to call him a woman. So that was the first time I thought this just isn't true, and that was when I started digging into it a little bit more. And so it was really from that standpoint, rather than a feminist standpoint, or, you know, my alarm bell should have gone off with the Victoria, Derbyshire stories about children being transitioned. But I had no idea about the damage that could be done medically to children, because we didn't broadcast at all. So it was so any viewer watching, if they had slightly skeptical views, which is what I had, they would think, well, I had a child a boy who wore a dress, and I had a girl who played football. It's just ridiculous. They'll grow out of it when they're 11 or 12, and that's it. They can't do anything about it after that. Yeah. Little did I know the truth of the matter, and the BBC just did not explain it. It didn't explain the issues with medical transition of children at all. It didn't even suggest that there were issues. So
yeah, I remember that the Victoria Derbyshire shows. I mean, I think very few of us were aware of this issue and the sort of facts behind it and the damage it's done. So you, I think, started.
Possibly Victoria Derbyshire didn't know at the time, and she did ask questions like, "Are they too young to be doing this?" But every guest was, you know, gender affirmative. They would have whole panels of trans young people plus Susie Green to discuss it. It was weak, you know, it was unbalanced.
But it sounds as if, Cath, it was quite deliberate. I mean, it can't be the case that the producers of the show didn't know there was another side to the story, surely. And do you think from the very beginning there was an intent somewhere in the organisation that they wouldn't show the negative side of the story? They would just celebrate the trans issue and trans children's, as he called them.
That is possible. I tend to go with ignorance, and just because of being a journalist, you shouldn't be ignorant. So there's more blame attached to, rather than intent, just you should have informed yourselves, or they should have informed themselves and then informed the rest of us. There was a lot of activism into the BBC. So there was a group called All About Trans, which 2011, 2012, 2013, 14 through to 16 would have interactions with a lot of BBC teams. And they were very extremely affirmative. They had meetings with complaints, they had meetings with Newsnight, they had meetings with really senior executives, commissioning executives. They were funded by the BBC, part funded by the BBC.
So they weren't inside the BBC, they were an outside lobby group, but funded.
They were an outside lobby group, but they had funding from the BBC. So the Times found out that it was about £20,000, but I did an FOI and they said it was out of time, 7 years too late. So, but the funding was given around 2011. So that's a long time ago now. And that came from,
so really,
no, there was a campaigner called Natalie McDermott who was very invested in supporting trans people. Apparently she'd seen a trans-identified man throw himself under a train, and from that moment on she got very invested in promoting the rights of people who identified as trans. And she was the sort of instigator of this on-road media project, which encompassed All About Trans, and this is how they got the interactions with the BBC. So having paid to set it up, they then, again, the group that they paid to set up, they then invited that group into the BBC to have meetings with all sorts of people. I mean, there's a photograph of Jane Fay talking to Evan Davis of Newsnight. You know, this is the sort of thing. But to have access to, it was really high level access to meeting with complaints. I mean, I tried afterwards to get a meeting with complaints. I said, you've met that side with the same guy said, you've met that side, can you now meet us? And
so just before we get to that, Cath, in terms of us and how you came to us, I'm just thinking, so from 2011 to about 2016, this lobby group was basically lobbying without any pushback and being very successful. So embedding the organisation and the ideology for about, when that's 5 years.
And the language. And it wasn't just London either. So they would, and it wasn't just the BBC. So they also had meetings with Cathy Newman. They went to regional newsrooms. I mean, you've probably noticed that like the BBC Regions is quite soaked in affirmation. So they had meetings on little local papers. So when you get, and it was really effective campaigning, because there are small local outlets now who are still extremely affirmative because of things that happened a long time ago. Style guides were changed.
Well, that's the thing. We were all in it, every, not just media, but everywhere. We were also slow in catching up with it, really, which is the problem, that it's just got embedded. I mean, when did you? So 2016, you kind of woke up to it with the Chelsea Manning story, and then I think you were trying to, you and a few other brave other journalists were trying to form networks and try and get some organisation around the opposite view.
We tried to get some response. I got involved in, we did set up that, there was a little network that we set up, which actually invited in Ruth Sawatka and Nick Williams. And so we had that talk. Right. But the head of diversity said, we've actually got a women at the BBC group. Can you disband your group? And so we said, well, don't really want to. And he said, well, you can, if you agree to disband your group, you can go ahead with your talk. So that was the agreement we made. So we had the talk, which was good. And that was in 2018. And then we disbanded the group. So then I got involved in Women at the BBC. And there were a few other, like...
Were there any men involved, Cath? just as out of curiosity, did men get involved with you, or was it mostly women?
No, there were men.
Yeah, men get it.
Yeah, there were men.
Good. Sorry.
Yes, yeah. And then, so women at the BBC, there were some like-minded people. So then we got involved in a language review that was being pushed. We didn't know at the time, but it was being pushed by diversity, and the sort of the guy in diversity who managed the BBC's relationship with Stonewall was also pushing for a language review. So that sort of all team kind of came together and was pulled together under the oversight of Kamal Ahmed, interestingly. But that came to nothing because there were many disputes about what sections should be in. Should we have language around gender identity? Should we talk about language around sex and gender identity? Or it was very troublesome. It was a very troublesome review. And if you look for it on the BBC website, you can say results are due soon or something. And that was 6 years ago. So that was a problem. And then the chair of BBC Women was leaving, and so I was part of the group that elected a new chair. And after that chair was elected, the BBC went fully inclusive.
And so that chair presumably was a gender identity advocate.
I think it became clear that it was an inclusive organisation. So if I tried to raise the issue on the discussion on Facebook, comments were deleted, and then I was told we won't host any comments on this at all. It was really difficult to have the conversation.
Wow.
We had a WhatsApp group that was also closed down after, I don't know if you remember, but it was leaked to BuzzFeed. There was in 2018, we had a conversation on a WhatsApp group. Trans women don't need maternity leave and this sort of thing, just general chit chat.
Yeah.
And that was leaked to BuzzFeed, and then that group was shut down as well. And the head of UK News at BuzzFeed at the time that happened was Stuart Miller, who is now became digital editor at the BBC. Is now an executive editor at the BBC.
Oh, really? So it really was a formal clampdown on freedom of speech, really, or talking about this issue.
Yes, I mean the WhatsApp group that was closed. Just was nothing to do with the BBC. It wasn't a formal group set up. It was just another. They were afraid of doxing and names being doxed and things like that. Right. It was just really hard to talk about it. If you talked about it on Pride, there was a difficulty. I emailed the Pride chair and said, do you support women's sex? Do you support? I actually asked if they support same-sex orientation, exclusive same-sex orientation, and sex-based rights. And they said the way that sex-based rights are described in the media, they're counter to some of our aims.
This is BBC Pride, Cath?
Yeah.
So basically,
in the end, when there was a conversation on there about somebody was saying I shouldn't be expected to be attracted to the other sex, something like that, and he was kind of really heavily criticised, and the moderators and the chairs did not speak up to support exclusive orientation. So that was, I just left the group then. I thought I can't, because I was in it as an ally for various reasons. So I was in it as an ally, but I just thought I can't support this anymore.
Well, it's like Stonewall with Nancy Kelly and BBC Women's Hour, I think, who said that, lesbians who don't include other trans men in their dating pool should check their bias, and they're really basically called them bigots. Let's go on to when was the BBC identity unit set up, Cath? Was that around that time?
2018.
2018, so all at the same time.
Time to set that unit up, because in 2018 it was a key year. Obviously, it was a consultation year. Women's Hour wasn't allowed to do anything on it until after the consultation closed. I had a film out that year which took 5 months to come, and it was eventually only given the okay the night before the consultation closed.
Now, just be clear, this is a consultation, now 2018, on self-identification.
Was that there was a consultation on reforming the Gender Recognition Act.
Yeah.
It was basically going to bring in self-ID. Do you remember?
This was the English attempt before the Scottish.
In the UK. It was a big deal. I mean, there wasn't.
I remember.
We didn't cover it a lot. Really didn't cover it a lot, which was a selective bias basically.
Yeah.
But then they gave Ben Hunt the job of LGBT correspondent, which was a new post. And they created another post, which was gender and identity correspondent, and that went to Megha Mohan, who is still at the BBC. But she still did the international story, and he was meant to do the domestic story.
Right.
And obviously, his journalism was extremely controversial. And then he was replaced by Lauren Moss and a producer, and then got a producer. So it was a proper unit, to have a dedicated producer, and that was Lauren and Moss and Josh Parry were doing that. So now Lauren's gone on to be a health correspondent, social affairs correspondent, I think. But anyway, that role has been cut. The whole role of LGBT correspondent has been cut, and there is still, I think. Josh Parry still does LGBT stories.
I mean, the problem was, I think, because LGB Alliance tried forever to have good conversations with Lauren Moss and Josh, and they would be nice to us, but they would never really do any stories, and certainly none that were favourable. The only one they did was the Mermaids one when we were in court, and we won the case. But I think the problem with that unit, you were saying, was that every single story that was about LGBT plus.
Yeah, that was. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And so what this creation of this role did, and it meant that whenever there was a story about it, it would be funneled into the LGBT identity unit. So nobody wanted the story anyway, because it's a very sticky story. Yeah. So obviously we know that it's a story that covers health, it covers education, social affairs, lots of court cases at the time, politics, but everybody was able to, all these people were able to say, I'll pass that to LGBT. Yeah. They don't want to do it. Or obviously there's a lot of work there, and they were really not able to do all of it. They wouldn't have, even if they wanted to. It was too much work. Mm-hmm. Also, they were for young journalists, really exposed on a very hot story, and it was almost unfair on them as well, because it was whatever they brought to the table. It was there were lots of complaints, both sides, but because if the BBC isn't affirmative in any tiny way, complaints flood in from it. You'd be surprised at how many complaints there are that the BBC is transphobic. It's quite astonishing. And so they think they've got the balance right, not really taking account of the fact that one side is rather sort of unbalanced in its approach to the issue. And so for example, we only wanted balance. We wanted both sides to we never wanted to shut down the other side at all. We just thought we need both sides of the story. That's all we want. It's just both sides, facts, and then both sides to talk about the facts. So because of the amount of complaints and the heat around the story, I do now, and a few of us do feel that it was a very exposed position for both of them to be in.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I did feel sorry for Lauren at times, because I just felt, I think she understood the issues, and I don't think she was anti us, but I just think she was under a huge amount of pressure internally.
Yeah, I think she's a really good health correspondent. She's a great correspondent now. But if you look back at some of the other stories that have been done by, for example, so when Caroline Lowbridge did her story, the heat on her was unbelievable.
What was that story, Cath?
The story was lesbians are being, it was about the cotton ceiling.
Oh, yes.
The big story about the cotton ceiling. It took forever to get on. And a long, long time. And it was difficult internally. They put a I mean, I personally thought, why have they put a byline on this story? But she had suffered so much, you know, from being the criticism she got. And I don't know, you know, I'm sure she got support internally, but so that's the kind of heat that is around.
Yeah. So let's go into your rather ingenious way of getting the attention of your bosses. Because after a while you decided that they weren't talking to you, so you should start tweeting.
So we did send so there were a lot of emails, sent a lot of emails like, this is wrong, that's not balanced, you haven't done this story, and so on and so forth. And then I did feel slightly ignored. Like, people were polite, but I felt that it wasn't getting any traction. So so I thought, if I do it on Twitter, then people will complain about me. And then the boss will have to read it, because they'll have to look at the complaints, which did happen. There were, you know, a lot of complaints about my social media and a lot of meetings with managers.
Did you do it anonymously first and then decide to use your own name? Is that?
I was anonymous a while, right, previously. I had been anonymous previously, but I thought I had to do it under my name to, firstly, to find people, and secondly to bring it to the attention of people. Because my defense was always, you know, if you know, the thing is, you're not allowed to express your opinions on social media. So my defense was always, firstly, it's all factual. but secondly, it's an opinion that trans women are women. That's an opinion, and the BBC expresses it every single day, 24 hours a day, 365 a year. So that was always going to be like my defense. Yeah. And it did, you know, it was quite an effective defense, because I didn't get sacked. But I just ran out of road in the end.
What was one of the tweets that you did was on you were worried the BBC internally was using the word cis, and they were going to you were worried to formalize that.
Yeah. So they did. So cis was being used on internal, like so on, for example, planning or story notes, briefings, that sort of thing. You could see it popping up, and I thought, this, there are too many. It's too sort of tentacular. I can't just email the person who's done this note or written this planning. It has to be from the top. But there's nobody to email, because the BBC is so huge. Like, they all had different managers, and it would get put on the back burner. Nobody would do anything about it. So that's when I thought, if I tweet about it, it will be so controversial. It will make cis an unconditionally controversial, contentious word. And that's what it did, because it wasn't really allowed, even though people were using it. It just wasn't really allowed. But that's how normalization starts, is people start everyday discourse. And I heard it on Radio 5. People would say, so blah, 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 cis woman, this is what cis means, as if it's true. Yeah. That's how it becomes normalized. And
it was a clever strategy. Did you think it kind of stopped the word being used formally within this BBC or on
that? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't sanctioned, as in it wasn't approved. It wasn't an approved word at the BBC. You weren't really supposed to use it, but you could see it creeping in, and that's how it starts. So I wouldn't take all the credit for it, but I think it did make it really, really controversial. Like, because they then did a disciplinary over how controversial it was. So they couldn't possibly approve it as a word for the BBC to use after that, if they've actually disciplined somebody over how controversial it is. So I think
they disciplined somebody for using it, or
for writing a thread about they just for even writing a thread about how controversial it is, being disciplined.
It's controversial.
That's how controversial it is. Like, it's controversial. It's so controversial.
And there was other stories that I loved. The one we talked about was it Hard Talk, when they did a
Hard Talk was a naughty one. So
suicide.
That was Sean Fay, the Sean Fay, and that was the presenter who said the exact wording was along the lines of, we know that trans people are at greater risk of self-harm and suicide. Roughly those.
Yeah.
And so that's not true. So, but because it was the presenter that said it and not the guest, I mean, if a guest had said it, it should have been challenged, but it was the presenter that said it. So this, of course, goes around the world, and it's, you know, if it's watched by somebody whose child identifies as trans, and then they hear that there's more likelihood that they'll commit suicide, that's a very bad thing to be broadcasting. So I watched it before it went out, and then I emailed the people saying, this isn't true, you should edit this. Or please, I was very nice. I said, please, can you look at this? It's not true. And I sent the links to say, you know, it's not true. And then after they pulled the show for 3 days. And then after 3 days, they said, thank you for alerting us, but it's fine. And we're broadcasting it. And then about 3 weeks after that, they had to put out a correction to say this was wrong. But they disciplined me. So in the meantime, they started a disciplinary action against me for I don't know what it was for. So it was technically it was lowering the standards of the newsroom. But I don't. We're supposed to raise concerns. It's like we have a bullet point on the BBC, like your duties as a beauty journalist, and one of them is raise concerns. So that's what I did. I raised a concern. And, it was ignored. It was wrong to ignore it.
Yeah.
They had to embarrass themselves with the correction, but they just pursued the disciplinary anyway. That was very silly. And on the cis tweet, on the cis one, that was when I took the whole thread down, and they said, well, but we're going to carry on the disciplinary unless you say you were wrong and promise never to do it again. So I thought, I can't, this is crime territory, so I can't do that. So I said, I'm not going to admit that I was wrong, because I was right. I did say, if you tell me what was wrong, a single thing that was untrue about this, I'll take it down. You tell me something that's untrue. Of course, nobody in the whole year-long experience could tell me a single thing that I'd said that was untrue. So,
and so the other, I think the other example you gave,
yes, that directly affecting LGBT Alliance.
LGBT Alliance, we got kicked off the, is it the ticker?
You done brought me down. So this it was. So this was a story about monkeypox, and this, I have to admit, this was a bit naughty one, because the Alliance raised concerns about monkeypox and the spread within the gay men community very early on, and was then heavily. Do you remember? It was really.
I do. Yes. Yeah.
How dare you stigmatize and everything?
Or Malcolm Clark was very concerned about it.
Yeah. So I thought. So then suddenly they had the LGBT correspondent on talking about how gay men should get. I think it was access to a vaccine sooner. It was the Trevor Higgins Trust thing, and it was like they should have priority for the vaccine, something along those lines. So I thought, this is like rewriting history here. Like we've always been at war with East Asia. So we had some things on the ticker, and I just put a line saying, LGBT Alliance has also raised concern about the spread of the disease. Oh my goodness. How could you? How could I? So then 2 people came up to me separately and said, you have to take that down. One was the same seniority as me. And I said no. And then another one was talent. And I said, I'm not doing it. I said, I'm not taking it down.
Come on, name names.
I'll tell you after. And then, so then that was a disciplinary as well for lowering the newsroom. Yeah.
For putting LGBT Alliance on the ticker at the bottom.
Yeah, I lowered the standards of the newsroom apparently. But these people have just got. I mean, when I say please complain to the BBC or to the newspaper or to the outlet, I really mean it, because both of these people came up to me having had texts on their phones from activists and saying, I've been told by my friend on my phone that this is wrong, you have to take it down. That's the sort of complaint.
That's amazing.
You shouldn't. You said complain through the normal channel.
Yeah.
Like most of us have to do.
Yeah.
So
you had about 2 or 3 disciplinaries taken out against you that lasted, what, months?
Yeah.
I mean, what did that feel like, Cath? It must have been quite, I mean, you're very robust, but, you know, there's only so much a body can take.
So I had support from, I had a very good union rep who, I really don't have words to describe how amazing she was. She was stunning.
Was that from NUJ?
Yeah.
Good.
Slightly NUJ, not exactly typical of the NUJ. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to be unfair to the NUJ.
Yeah.
But yeah, so she was marvelous, and also I had a very firm. There's the one thing about this isn't based on feminism. This was based on journalism. It was like I know I'm right because it was. This is a truth, and I'm a journalist, and I knew that I was right, and I knew that if you get into a room with these people, they haven't got the words to explain why they are right, because they're not right.
Yeah.
So that does fortify you. So I'm sure it fortifies everybody else who's been involved in any kind of disciplinary or case along these lines. It does fortify you. It's like you don't ever doubt that you're the baddie. Like you're not the baddie. So that does fortify you. And sort of had support. So that was fine. So there were 6 months of the first one. And now that was dropped, but they didn't tell me that it was dropped. So as far as I was concerned, when the next disciplinary started, there was three now running against me. So that was when I put in a grievance and said, this is harassment. And so the grievance was upheld on the grounds of procedural errors, but not upheld on the grounds of harassment. But for that to happen, they would have had to examine the treatment of other people who affirm gender identity. So I would have had to find proof that people who do the same thing in an affirmative style are not disciplined.
Yeah.
So that was just not going to happen. I was never going to be able to do that. I mean, the volume of material. And it's also like you're arguing with an octopus, really. It's like trying to get a squid into a string bag. The entire BBC does not harass itself for being affirmative and in that way. So I was happy with that grievance. And the people who did the grievance were some of the first people I spoke to who had like a really kind of coherent approach to the whole thing. But it was upheld, and by that time I put in for redundancy and I left.
So you left, was it 2023?
Yes.
So you just felt you couldn't do there was nothing more you could do at that point.
Yeah, I was just getting in the way. It was so awkward. Like nobody was ever going to listen to me again. Nobody was ever going to pick up one of my story pictures. It was just not. It was just hampering the whole project in a way. I'd made myself so unpopular in a certain way, not generally, just in a certain in this. It was just I was never going to get any traction on it. I didn't think again. I didn't think it would be something that would be possible.
Just delving a bit deeper into the psychology of the BBC. I think when we spoke once about this, you said that you kind of thought that the BBC sort of realised they'd got themselves in a difficult situation over this, but they were in too deep and they couldn't find a way of getting out of it.
Yeah,
Is that still the case?
I think it's true. There are good people at the BBC, and some, not just some, but a lot. I'm not a defunder at all. I know a lot of people come onto our senior journalism posts and say defund the BBC, but that's not me. There are most of the journalists who are at my level, up to a certain level, they're just amazing. They're working under the most difficult circumstances, really hard. And so I'm not a defunder at all. And there are great people at the BBC. I do think that they realise that they have got themselves in a bind on this issue.
Yeah.
And I think they would like to start rowing back.
Yeah. And I think they have, but in some ways, but just that, you once said, I think when we were talking in our panel, that the BBC justified themselves and their bias by saying that about the facts, because the facts were all on our side, if you like, the true facts. It was impartial.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah,
it was impartial, not to give the facts. I mean, how did that work? Truly Orwellian.
That was in response to the disciplinaries. Right. And the finding was that just because you're accurate doesn't mean that you're impartial. It's true in a way, because it's to do with due accuracy. But the problem is that the BBC considers the lie that people are the opposite sex to be the impartial position.
Right.
It considers the truth that they are not the opposite sex to be a biased position, and one that it is not allowed to articulate on air or on its website. Yeah. So, and I think a lot of news outlets are like this. I mean, often, even today, we've seen the Darlington nurses story, and that's reported as the nurses not wanting trans colleagues in their bathrooms, which simply isn't true. They don't want men. But even the Telegraph and the Times, who have been fantastic on reporting issues, struggle to say these people are men. It sticks somewhere here. They just struggle to say it. But this is the truth. So the BBC is not alone in this, and Sky is even worse than the BBC. And even GB News, people say it's just the BBC. It's absolutely not. It's a culture of fear of saying that these men who say they're women are men who say they're women.
Well, there's, in the Supreme Court case last week, I think it was, they really got to the nub of the problem here. One of the justices kind of eventually twigged with her, because she was saying, well, the position is a person who says they're a trans woman doesn't have to look like a trans woman, should just look like a man, talk like a man. And if she goes into a women's space, if women's exclusive space, changing room, whatever, the staff can't ask her if she's got a certificate, because they're not allowed to ask. And that makes it impossible. I mean, if she just suddenly got it, it means that any man, with good or bad intent can just say, I'm a woman, and get into a space. And that just is unworkable, and to say the least.
I think the media's never examined this.
No.
There's a fake distinction between self-ID and a GRC. So of course there's a legal distinction, but in reality there's no distinction at all. Every single person, even with a GRC, is self-identified. But they just have the piece of paper. So that at root, it's all self-identity, and this is something which I think could be really kind of fruitfully examined, but never has been, because it's very, very difficult. It's useful to have that distinction between true trans and somebody.
And the media aren't just not willing to go there. Do you think, I mean, I think we're sort of hoping that and feeling that things might be getting slightly better at the BBC. Occasionally, Women's Hour, and you get sudden, for the first time, you get another point of view that's almost put in an unbiased way. So do you think it's changing, and how far is it still to go?
Yes, I do think it's changing. There are people now all over the BBC in the way that there were once sort of trans activists in every department, and it only takes one. Now there are people, sometimes very senior people, dotted all over the BBC who have a proper journalistic approach to it. So they don't necessarily take a view on either side, but they have a proper journalistic approach, which is what we which is very different to an affirmative approach, because an affirmative approach, you're closing your eyes and ears to half the story. So there definitely are people like that, really accomplished journalists, and they have a very different approach. There's a continuing problem with selective bias because every BBC journalist is overloaded because of the cuts. So when it's a difficult, so this is classed as a difficult and contentious story, and it always gets referred up. So it takes a lot of editorial time.
Yeah.
So it is quite a resource consuming,
heavy.
resource heavy story, in terms of time and mental effort and finding somebody to blame it on. But it's that's a lot of that is quite a lot of the reason why the stories don't get done. And in a way, because it's not a specialty, the background isn't there. So when it was a specialty and there was the opportunity to really dig down into the background and do these maybe slightly niche stories, they're not niche, but anyway, they were considered niche. Then they didn't do them, but now there's more of a willingness to do them. It's much tougher resource.
It still feels to be the same though, in terms of there being a ban on certain people speaking in the BBC. I mean, Julie Bindel, Helen Joyce, Kate Harris, Kate Barker. I mean, all these women who speak for, and they do get on other outlets, but not so much. But is there an informal bias or ban on these individuals, do you think?
Yeah, there's no formal blacklist, absolutely not. But there are people who've been touched on the shoulder and people who aren't. So if you have, say, for example, like one of the things that Julie says is that because of, and I think she's right, is that because of her work on this issue, that means that all the other work that she does, prisons, women who are victims of abuse, she doesn't get invited on to talk about that. So it's not just on this issue. You have this who then don't get invited on to talk about all the other issues to do with women's rights, even though they have some very salient and valuable points to make. So there is definitely not. I mean, Helen was on once. She was on Radio 5 on the day the Cath review was published. But of course, that was one interview that wasn't cycled through the day. These interviews that day, that the interviews with trans-identified men went on and on and on all day long. One interview and that was it. But that counts as statistics. So.
And we should just touch on the Hannah Barnes Newsnight story, because it was the same there, that normally that big exclusive that she got on Newsnight would continue to be picked up by other parts of the BBC. But it just, although it was a great story and it was amazing the BBC did it, given the problems they have, but then it just didn't get taken any further.
It was almost sort of siloed in a way. It was that journalism was, astonishing journalism at the time, and very much so. In fact, it's that journalism that we have to thank for the Health Secretary commissioning the Cath review. It was world-changing journalism.
And it's amazing, because I'm a journalist and you're a journalist, but in my day, you'd kill for a story like that, even if you had no bias about anything. It's an amazing story.
You would have detransitioners on. You would, you would really, pursue it with vigor. But that was going on a kind of completely separate train track to all this other incredibly affirmative material that was being kind of vomited all over the website at all times, and live coverage. And it was so odd that we had this amazing story and we didn't do with it. It was amazing. I mean, it did. I think it changed the world. It did. That has impacts internationally. So there's no doubt about it. And the BBC was responsible for that. So,
when we had a meeting with David Jordan, we at the LGB Alliance, and he was kind enough to give us a hearing, and he he was rightly boasting about that story, and you would, because it's a fantastic story, but he couldn't answer the question why other parts, why it wasn't followed up, why the BBC journalists weren't proud of it. And I think he probably knew there was a problem there, but he couldn't admit it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the problem with it, in that there was no problem with the journalism. Journalism was amazing, but then that was used to do a hell of a lot of heavy lifting. That did all that and the interview with Kira Bell on Newsnight. You remember that?
Yeah.
Well, one before that was overturned, Kira Bell was on Newsnight.
Yeah.
And so the Kira Bell interview and the
Hannah Barnes
and Deb Cohen, we have to give also Deb Cohen, credit.
What was that?
Deb Cohen was the correspondent on all of the Tavistock journalism.
Yeah.
Did I mean, amazing. So those two items do all the heavy lifting when it comes to the BBC saying we are balanced. Yeah.
So that brings us to what you're doing.
Sorry, just to be fair to David, I don't think he would have known the nitty-gritty of how that was and wasn't picked up.
David Jordan.
I mean, he's responsible for all content. Not, I think there's somebody in charge of news who has particular responsibility for how those stories are disseminated. Yeah.
So bringing it right up to date, because you're now still working on. You're not in the BBC, but your role in scene and journalism, you're still working on this issue and trying to get reform at the BBC. And I think there's a consultation that's current. The BBC is wanting opinions on.
Yes.
So, is it their style guide or?
No, it's not. So this is the editorial guidelines, which covers all content at the BBC, and this is David Jordan's manner. So it's not the new style guide, which says you have to affirm that trans women are women. It's a different sort of thing. So it covers a big picture of harm or offence, and the big picture of it covers everything from scheduling to general principles of accuracy and impartiality. It's kind of like it's the Bible that has to sit on all the desks. And so it is worth responding. So we've responded so far on 2 issues. We've responded on gender identity, and we've responded on. They say that for the editorial purposes, the age of a child is set stops at 16, and then you're a young person. So we've said that should be 18. Yeah. Cited various, UN and all of that. And then there's also gender identity. So they do mention gender identity a couple of times in the guidelines, and we think that's wrong because it is a highly contested concept. And they should replace it with gender assignment, which is a legally noted term. So that's your recommendation, your consultation did not agree that. So that's 2 of them. Yeah, we're also going to put in something on suicide, which is to say you need to make sure that you don't ascribe motive to suicide, which is missing at the moment. Right. Which happens so often, as we know. So. So if people want to, there's still time for just individuals can get involved in the consultation. Can they get your consultation at your website, Scene in Journalism? Yeah, so we have actually, yes. So we've got the links all on our Substack, but we'll make sure there's a separate page just with the links, because at the moment they're attached to 2 kind of chunks of text and prose. So I think obviously we need to have a separate page if people are just for people listening in. So if they want to get involved in the consultation, they can get you your website page. It's your BBC, and they are good enough to ask our opinion. So give your opinion, and it doesn't always have to be negative about the BBC. Like if the BBC does something well, it's really important to let them know that they've done it well, because they take note of everything. They take note of all those appreciations as well as complaints. Well, I think that's a very good point to sort of finish on, that people, if you love the BBC and if you want it to get better, you've got to give the feedback, complaint, or if you say they do something good, then you can compliment them on it. So we just keep working on it, is what you're doing. keep in contact with all of these news outlets. Let them know when it's wrong. I mean, the latest thing I've seen is that GB News has been community noted for saying Darlington nurses don't want trans colleagues banned. And this is the latest push. I think it's very clever, is that somebody's community noted them on X and said it's nothing to do with trans colleagues. It's just because they're men. So there are all sorts of ways to let all the outlets know that what they're doing isn't good enough at the moment.
Well, that's a very good positive way to end it, because we really have to, well, thank you, Cath, for doing this webinar, but also thanks for sticking up for facts and the truth. I mean, it's been a hard slog and you're still doing it, but it's really appreciated by those of us who know how difficult it is.
Yes, I'll just say something now for all the people who are the journalists who are not named ever and who are doing things, you know, without being named, and it's hard. I know it's really, really hard. So they all need a big gold star. But
I
think,
well,
100%.
Okay, Cath, look, thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure this will be very useful for people really trying to find out what's going on at the BBC, because sometimes it's just a big mystery to us all, and to me especially.
Yeah. Don't give up hope. They're coming good. They are going to come good.
Great. That's a great way to end it. Thank you, Cath. Take care now.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. Bye.
Bye. Bye.